So, hello again, Adam Fairclough, aka Evil Boris, here again today for HDTV test to have a look at the HDR of Resident Evil 2. We're just loading into the game here. Now, first off, let's get a few things out of the way. Resident Evil 2, I'm playing this here on Xbox One X. The reason for this is that we can record HDR video straight out of the console itself, so it's really easy to make the videos on this console. But before we go any further, let's just preface a couple of changes we're going to make before we go into the game. If you head on over into the Xbox video settings, you can now tick the box for YCC 422. Previously, this was the default option and all HDR content was output at this, and this switch actually only affected SDR content. However, they changed something a little while ago, and by default HDR content was actually coming out at YCC 420, so slightly lower quality. Presumably this is to help with compatibility and maybe prevent some of the problems that people have with bandwidth when it comes to using HDR content. But you can now turn this box on and this will actually improve the HDR output a little bit. We'll be getting a slightly higher quality output. So that's just the first thing. We'll go back to Resident Evil. We're going to be having a look at the full game here. I'm going to probably look at about the first 15 minutes of the game, so if you're really sensitive to spoilers, you probably don't want to watch past me adjusting the settings, which we will do first. I'll give you warning when we're about to start the game, and I'll give you warning about spoilers, except for Bruce Willis is a ghost, Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's dad, Dumbledore dies. So if you're sensitive about spoilers, sorry about that. But let's go into the game first of all. Hit start. And we're just going to pop through into the options screen. First place I go now whenever I'm looking at any game. And we've got a few video settings. You've got the option for film noise. I'm actually going to turn this off here. We're going to actually take the grade out. This will actually make some of the banding in the game a little bit more visible. So if you're sensitive to colour banding, posterization, you probably want to leave that on. And we're going to go and look at what you're interested in, which are the HDR settings. So we've got our typical max brightness, peak luminance output display here. This ranges from 400 nits at the very end of the scale, all the way up to 4000 actually at the other end of the scale. Now what we're going to be doing for the sake of this video, as we usually do, I'm going to max this out. We're going to put it at 4000. Some of you will be setting it there anyway, as that's what your displays are tone mapping to. But for the sake of this, we can actually see a little bit more data behind the scenes if we go to this top end. Also, bear in mind that most games are made with much higher luminance outputs internally anyway, maybe using 32-bit precision, so a lot more data behind the scenes. So this gives us probably the clearest look into the internals of the game. So for most people, as we've said before in other videos, just do what it describes here. If you're a little bit unsure, you're struggling to see where it maxes out with Resident Evil, again, it was not going to cause you any major problems, but you can go a little bit higher, go a little bit further if you need to. But this is a screen we're really interested in, and if you have played the demo of Resident Evil 2 Remake, you will see that the part of the demo that we played actually appeared quite washed out at times, and there was a lot of noise online about why this was, has it got fake HDR, is it broken, all this kind of stuff. So I spent a lot of time looking at both the demo and actually at the full game now as we've got this, to try and figure out why that was. My initial impressions of the demo were that that's actually just the colour grading for that section of the game, but we needed the full game to be able to verify that properly. So what we've actually got here, the HDR brightness as it's called, or the brightness HDR brackets, this is essentially a comfort adjustment is the way I would describe it. So if you're not playing in optimal conditions, i.e. a dark room, and again, just to reiterate, if you're playing HDR content is designed to be played in a dark room. But if you're not playing in a dark room, and the developers know this, they give you the option to brighten up the image. However, there are some caveats and there are some downsides to adjusting it too much. By default, the game tries to apply an appropriate paper white based upon the max luminance. Now I don't fully understand what the logic is here, because what essentially happens is the higher you have your peak luminance, the higher the game is going to try and get you to set the paper white. So you've got higher peak luminance, but then it's going to ask you to increase paper white, which actually reduces dynamic range. So this is a little bit counterproductive in some situations, but again, it may be down to the system that this game uses. Devil May Cry 5 uses the same system, Resident Evil 7 uses the same system, and that came out a couple of years ago. That was a relatively early HDR title. It may have been the screens that they were testing on at the time were some of the, you know, those earlier OLED models which were noticeably dimmer, especially when playing games, and it may be that this was developed as a method of guiding users towards having an acceptable level of brightness for their game. If you're watching this, you're probably watching this in optimal environments, but again, we will know that end consumers don't necessarily want to have the reference-like image. They want to have the image they like the look of. And you know what? You might not be playing in dark conditions. It might be daytime when you're playing Resident Evil. If you're a heathen, you should be playing this in the dark with the headphones on. That's the best way to play it. Especially as this game supports Dolby Atmos on Xbox One X. There's a note for you AV enthusiasts. Dolby Atmos speaker support, and if you've got the Dolby Atmos headphone add-on little thing you can purchase, the bit of software license, you can also use Dolby Atmos for headphones, or the game's got built-in, I can't think how you pronounce it, binaural audio support. So, what have we got going on here? That's a lot of talking about this screen. The game will typically guide you towards fairly high paper white values. If you're on about 1000 nits on the previous screen for your peak white, which is going to be about in the middle, you're going to land on around about 200, maybe a little bit higher of paper white, which is okay. And I think a lot of people will find that acceptable if you're at 1000 nits. However, if you're on 4000 nits, and the chances are if you're hitting 4000 nits, you've actually got a display that isn't 4000 nits, unless you're playing it on like a Dolby Pulsar monitor, which you probably aren't. If you've got 100 grand knocking around, maybe that's what you're using. But the chances are you're playing on a display that is tone mapping or RGB mapping those 4000 nit RGB values down to a lower value. Display's not going to be that bright. Then what the game is going to do is actually going to ask you to then increase the overall brightness of the image further, and it's going to really impact on your image, and it's probably going to throw out any dynamic tone mapping stuff that's going on, or image processing algorithms that, you know, happen in the background on a lot of displays now that can't be defeated. So that is always going to be there. Based upon these measurements, we're sitting, depending on what your brightness is, if you're on about 4000, I reckon we could easily be hitting 300, especially if we look at those other titles and how their scales behaved. It could even be pushing higher on this title. I wasn't able to determine exactly what the paper white was at 4000 on this game. However, we could see from those other games when they were set at 2000, they were hitting 300 nits recommendation, which is going to be too bright. And I talked about this in the Forza Horizon video, which should be out by the time this video comes out too. So, based upon what we've seen, the very darkest end of the scale, this blue bit here, this sets our paper white value at 50. Now, that's very low, probably too low. I'm not sure if this is a throwback to SDR displays and talking about 50% grey, as you know, that colour that sits halfway between black and white, or if there's another reason we always end up with 50 as the entry point on a lot of games. But what we're going to find is, broadly, for this video, and this would be my recommendation to most people watching this, 3 or 4 clicks from that darkest point is going to bring us up to about 130, 150 equivalent paper white nit value. This will give us a great image, so we get that HDR punch. You may adjust this a little bit, you may prefer a little bit darker, you might prefer a little bit brighter, but this would be a good point to start. We'll come through with the measurements that we saw, but generally, even if you have it set at the darkest, what you're going to get here is you're going to get an image that is primarily sitting within the SDR range, and we hit 1000 nits maximum for any brightest things in the game. However, that SDR portion of the image, I think for most people, is going to seem a little bit too dark. You know what, you might look at this and you might think that's great and that works for you. By all means do so. But we've seen for most people, they prefer a little bit of extra brightness. So we're going to go three or 4. I'm going to set it on 4 for this video. In doing so, we're going to go a little bit above 1000 nits. The lower end of the image will become a little bit less dark. The way that these types of paper white adjustments happen, and we'll try and throw up an image on screen here, is the very, very blackest point, the 0, which on this calibration screen is actually the background. Code value 0, pure black, that is anchored. And then the adjustment that we're making is adjusting that 50 nit, or that neutral grey, or whatever whatever value it is that they're using, and we're actually raising the brightness using that as the next anchor point. And this, you can see here, has an effect on these very, very dark parts of the image and some of the shadows. The very darker parts change really, really rapidly, and the brighter parts change less rapidly. So we have to be really, really careful with that, because you can blow out whites, you can raise the blacks really substantially, and you can get an image that maybe doesn't look so great. However, we want an image that looks nice. And I've played the intro to this game probably 30 times over the last few nights to try and give you the best head start that we can get. So we're going to go with this 3 or 4 clicks from the very, very darkest, and that shouldn't vary too much depending on your peak brightness. Okay, so other stuff that's in here, I think we talked about the audio. Again, you've got some different things there. Binaural, yeah, I said it right. Got Dolby Atmos there. In fact, I'll tell you what we'll do. Let's put this to real-time binaural on there. So actually, if you happen to be listening to this video with headphones on, you might hear some of that sound. There we go. So there's your settings. Peak brightness as it describes. That second screen with the red and white bars go all the way to the darkest end, so it's just blue, and then we want to go 3 or 4 clicks. Let's get going with the game here. And off we go. So first off, we will see the most high resolution in-game video burger you will ever see. And an incredible beard. Now, there's not a lot of crazy HDR things going on here, but what will be quite visible to you, particularly if you're in a darker room, is there's a lot of shadow detail here. If we're playing this game in SDR, the SDR version actually gives a different set of controls, and the SDR version actually allows us to crush the blacks very, very, very easily. And overall, I think because of the lack of HDR in the SDR version, there is also a level of artificial contrast enhancement going on. So the game actually looks not so good for various different reasons in SDR. I really, really recommend that you play this game in HDR if you've got the capability. But we should be able to see now some of the lighting on his cheek there. You can kind of see that generally it's relatively subtle, except for when some headlights come on screen. And we get huge peak brightness there. And here again, brilliant. This looks super real. The reflections, the headlights, all really, really great, really high peak luminance. If we're a little bit darker on that paper white setting, you're not going to get quite as much impact from those things. Again, you'll also see the colour of those headlights changing depending on what you've set your peak luminance at. And one thing I did notice this game does a good job of doing is ensuring there's no shift in colours at the very, very top end of the picture. Typically we see tail lights are a really good example of that, how if there's a little bit of a hue shift, those will become a little bit more orangey in colour, but they remain really, really red in this game.
What am I gonna do?
Oh, hello. So, some really, really good examples there. We come up to another part of the intro, so we can see all the different specular effects happening here. The game's actually set at this point kind of late afternoon, early evening on a really grey, rainy day, so it's not actually pitch black. But that bit there looks real. It's amazing, really, really amazing. And this was an area where I really noticed when I was playing in SDR, how there was a huge amount of contrast. You know, one side of her face almost black as she walks out of that phone box. So you're actually losing a lot of detail at the dark end, and a lot of clipping at the top end. But you know, this is a really nice environment to test out the HDR to begin a game with, actually, because we've got lots of mist. We've got various different light sources, and we can see that we're hitting, you know, the peak values of you know, kind of 4,000 nits or so. And then we can see something that I really love in this, and that's this scene here. We've got the artificial lights surrounding the fuel station here, and this is something that games that do HDR really well and displays that can display HDR really well do a really great job of representing. Using standard dynamic range and standard color gamuts and standard color volumes, we're actually unable to properly represent how bright something like this is while still maintaining that it has color in it. So, I mean, I've got it set to 4,000 nits, so actually on my display as I play this, I can't see the color, but I know that normally this is a very bright greeny blue color. And photographers and artists handle that in different ways in order to produce a sensation of bright, luminous colour. But now we've got displays and technologies that can display this, we get a much more true to life representation of what they might look like. And I think that the best examples of that are always artificial lights, neon lights in particular. When you see a neon light with your own eyes, typically very colourful, very red, very blue, very green, whatever that colour might be. Try to take a photo of one or look at one in a film, and there's two things that they can do. They can either dim it right down to maintain the colour, but it doesn't look very bright. And you bear in mind that a neon light probably is 12,000 nits, something like that, if we were to measure it in the same way that we measure a TV. So they either dim it right down to maintain the colour saturation, or they brighten it right up and they make the centre of it very white. So if you think about a lightsaber, for example, that's a good example of that too. They keep it very white in the centre in order to create a perception of brightness. However, if that lightsaber were real, I suspect that it would be solid green in the middle, just very bright. So let's head on in, let's have a look at some other things. So again, it's games like this where it becomes really hard to separate the graphical quality from the HDR quality. And this is where the data visualizations come in really handy, because we can see where the peak brightness is. If you're unaware as to, you know, what part of the image is benefiting from the HDR, we get a better example of it. And what we'll probably see in here is that it's not super bright, even though we're shining a torch. It's all kind of conforming to kind of sub 100 stuff, unless we get very close to something and we can see the torch is glowing a different colour there.
Are you okay? Wait here. I'll check it out.
So I'm just going to start sprinting through this demo now, clicking away. Just two friends. Oh no, not two friends at all. Horrifying. As we said, horrifying. Not as horrifying as going to a family member's house and seeing they've got motion interpolation turned up to max and the sharpness on 100. You know, that is truly horrifying for anybody watching this video. I'm trying to shoot this guy in the best way I can because I've got observers watching me. You. Grab this key and let's run through here. This is all very much broadly the same, so I'm going to come out of here. Unlock the door. Check that I'm still recording. I am. And we're going to get out of here. So one of the things you can see here is that there is always a lot of shadow detail. Even if we drop this back down to the darkest thing, the game isn't trying to hide things from you in the darkness. It's trying to maintain a fairly natural level of lighting. Because ultimately, if there is any source of light in the room, it's not going to be pitch black, so we wouldn't expect your display to be going anywhere near to its, near to its darkest capabilities.
Don't shoot!
Get down!
So again, we can see even in these cutscenes, a lot of them are, fairly low peak luminance, which is kind of what we'd expect, especially from something that's maybe going for a slightly more cinematic look. But we'll go outside again and we'll see all these headlights and the light source is really, really kicking in. So we're coming up to a very, very intense, really, really punchy HDR sequence now.
Come on! Get in! Hold on.
So I might leave this to play out. You can see again, super realistic lighting there. Look at it. It looks real. That whole section just blows my mind every time I see it, how real that looks. And that looks even better if you're looking at that on a really good display.
Wait, you're a cop?
Yeah, Leon Kennedy. You are?
Claire. Claire Redfield.
So this part of the game,
Live around here?
not so much grading as we see later on. There is a little bit of colour grading. We can see some of the typical kind of blue
I don't know what to expect anymore.
blue lighting on the side of his face there. And then we've got a pre-rendered intro. Let's skip over this.
Attention all citizens.
So again, you'll see hopefully the waveform in the bottom there. We can see that these sections here, lots of very, very dark things, sitting normally under 100 nits. When we see an actual source of light, then we get that increase in the dynamic range happening. So we get those brighter peaks, and we're getting some of that dark at the same time. So we've got a huge amount of dynamic range at certain points in this game.
It's a big city. Perhaps.
And that's on top of the visual quality being super, super impressive. I'll take a few screenshots of certain bits of this game, so if you want to have a look at my Xbox profile, which is Evil Boris space HDR, one of the nice things about the Xbox is that you can take HDR screenshots, so if you've not got the game, you can come and have a look at what some of these scenes look like.
More like running.
Yeah, good call.
Leon, you gotta back up.
So every point in this intro, the car headlights and the truck headlights have been really good examples of that very, very peak brightness.
Holy shit.
And it's also an interesting example if you're playing in a really dark room. Those are really bright, those really do give you a sense of urgency as they're coming at you out of your TV. We can see those higher peak values, 1,000, 1,500 or so from the sparks from those light sources. We can see them from the explosions too. So this sequence now, as we move into this kind of fiery area, there's some fairly heavy colour grading going on here. The very typical Hollywood teal and orange, obviously the orange from the flames, but there's also some kind of orangey colours put into some of the other highlights. But we'll also see, you'll see the blue teal colour in the smoke and in some of the other reflections on the road there. So again, some quite heavy grading here, but I think beyond the grading of the colour there,
Let me
And there's a lot of fog happening. A lot of, it's not fog, is it? It's smoke from the fire. And I think that's one thing that maybe the demo didn't really make very clear, is that you know, we're essentially in a city that's on fire, it's ruined. And it's much like going and seeing a fireworks display, I suppose, and there's all that smoke in the air, and that's going to bring down the, well, not bring down, it's going to basically cause a lot of light to be caught up in those smoke particles that are flying around, so it's going to be lighter and greyer, even though it's very, very dark. Now, this is a section after, again, doing extensive testing, looking at the data, but then also playing the game over and over and over. When we set that paper white down too low, and I had it on 50, which overall looked quite good, there are certain areas of the games that became, you know, almost uncomfortable to play. It was so dark, I struggled to find my way around here, and that was in a pitch black room. So it's kind of why I settled on this sort of 130 nit value, which is broadly where I would kind of land on Devil May Cry 5 and Resident Evil 7 as well, and in a lot of games as well. We're now just approaching the start of the demo. Ever so slightly different because I'm playing it as a different character. The one thing the game does really, really great, I think, in terms of how it's been designed to look, they do a really great job of kind of maintaining a particular look that the Resident Evil games had. And I think actually a lot of horror games have in general, which is to have quite compressed highlights. We can kind of see this kind of effect here, and I'll bring up some images on screen. You see that this is a fairly common thing across the series. If we go back and look at some of the other remakes of the games, Resident Evil 0, the original Resident Evil remake, you'll see that these all have this look where they're quite heavily graded, highlights are very, very compressed, maintain the highlight detail, and often the blacks are a little bit elevated because they're going for this very cinematic look, so they're trying to keep the level of lighting kind of appropriate for a game that requires you to see a lot of the time in the dark. Resident Evil 2 as a remake is interesting because we've got this look of compressed highlights, but then there are these light sources which are really, really making use of HDR technology, so you can see that they're very, very bright. But they don't always have a bearing on the surroundings so much, so although the lights are much, much brighter, they don't necessarily cast light onto the surfaces in quite the same way. But they look good, you know, that's the main thing. And you know, and this is where looking at these games as products, you know, as pieces of art, if you want to call it that, you know, they have been designed to look a certain way. It can become quite difficult to try and draw a line between what is the technical reason for why something's happening and what is the intent of how this game should look. And HDR titles in particular have an additional challenge in that we've got the developers trying to make the game look a certain way, but then also the developers having to provide a certain set of tools or adjustments to the players to be able to make changes to the game and the way that it looks, so it sort of suits the player's environment. So we get a little bit of variability, and hopefully these videos that we're doing are kind of helping with this, so you can start off in a good place. Again, if you're watching this video, you're probably an AV enthusiast, so you're probably playing in a kind of suitable room anyway, but you certainly don't want to be spending 8 hours with every single game that you play trying to get the kind of best setup. If that's what you want, maybe PC gaming's for you. Endless settings, never play any games. Well, that was me anyway. But we're just going to come to an end here. I'm just going to hit this button. We're going to see something quite interesting. We see it's very, very dark here. Again, we've got one set of grading in this room. Actually, it's a kind of quite warm colour, even though we've got lights that are throwing light up onto this statue. It's a very, very warm coloured light. You can see it up here as well. We can see the light sources, and we can see it's all very, very orangey. As we come through into the room, you will physically see it change from one colour grade to another as the torch that Claire is holding swings across the screen. So keep an eye out for that. So we go from very, very dark. She has a look around, still quite dark, quite beige. Camera goes across the screen, turns blue. There we are. So it becomes blue, cooler colour, bluey green, and the blacks become elevated. Okay, so this is very, very clearly intentional, and we can see maybe why people were concerned about it. And this might look a little bit upsetting to you if you've got a really great display that can do blacks really, really well. However, you know, as we've seen from the rest of the game, it doesn't stay like this all the time, and this is just how they want it to look. Whether or not they're trying to maintain that kind of misty, foggy, mysterious feeling, or whether or not they're trying to go for just a generically cinematic look, I don't know. But don't worry, this will settle down. So I'm actually going to end it there. I hope you've enjoyed this little look at the beginning of the game and look at some of the HDR components of the game and the settings at the beginning. So just to recap before we go, you want to set your max brightness as it describes. As we said, you can always go a little bit higher if you wish. And then set your second screen, your HDR brightness, which is that screen with the red and blue bars. Take it all the way to the darkest edge, so you've got just the blue bar showing. And 3 or 4 clicks should bring us to a kind of appropriate level for an HDR game that gives us a really good balance of dark darks and then really punchy peak brightness. Thanks for watching. Subscribe below if you haven't already. If there's any other games you'd like me to look at in future, drop them in the comments below. Ta-ra!